Therapists of Reddit, what have been the most manipulative things done by incredibly difficult patients? Was a therapist in a short term, 2 weeks at most, psych hospital, had a very clean-cut man come in with a police hold pending a mental health court hearing. He was a dentist with a fairly well-known practice in the area and the police had brought him after a domestic dispute where he choked his wife. First clue, we were dealing with a narcissist manipulator. He choked his wife because she found evidence of him cheating on her and asked him about it. By the end of his stay, he had managed to convince his psychiatrist to let him sign in as a voluntary patient, then asked to sign out against medical advice within hours of the doc letting him sign in with the guarantee that he'd not try to sign himself out. He also got one of the nurses on his side and he had to be taken off her caseload because of how much she was doing for him. I talked to the wife and it's honestly one of the only times I've ever gone against my patient's best interest and told her to start looking for options for herself to get away from the situation. What scared me the most was that he could turn on off an emotion in a split second. 1 second he'd be sobbing, then he'd stop the minute you asked him something else. The last bit is scary. Those people are unnerving. Therapist here. I think the situations that stand out to me are parents of teens being a bit manipulative. The teens are my clients. They would lie about needing a letter about their child for one thing when really they wanted to use it to get their child out of some consequences, punishments at their school. Or parents emailing me to ask me to get little Johnny to do this. Anything from eating more vegetables, go outside more, not be friends with so and so. Basically asking me to do the parenting. I make it a policy to show teens any and all emails that their parents send me to avoid secrets. I tell parents about this policy on day 1. I'm there to help the teen with their goals, not the parents' goals. Most people lie about something in therapy. I take that as a sign that trust needs to be further established in our relationship, and I don't expect the whole truth right away. I've had people try to push my buttons or corner me in hypothetical situations. If you could choose between having dinner with me or Michael Jordan, you definitely wouldn't choose me, or would you leave me alone in your office with your purse sitting out? Clinical director couples therapist, making several comments in this thread. Been at it a while. In university I did volunteer counseling which occasionally involved house calls. I saw a couple at their wealthy family's farm about 40 minutes from my city. I would do 2 individual sessions followed by a couples session, for a total of about 3 hours. When the husband left the room so wife and I could do our individual stuff, he was doing C. This next bit was a major crime, so I'm going to change details for anonymity. He gets high on M and tells wife he's at location X, and when she goes to meet him he kidnaps their twin daughters. A police chase ensues and there's a standoff. A court case comes of this and they considered flying me from my new location elsewhere back to the original place of practice to testify. Thankfully that was not the case. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I once had a client tell me he had cancer. Even faked walking with pain as he came in for a session after half his colon was removed. I did some research and it turns out the whole thing was a lie. He mentioned doctors and diseases that didn't even exist. I continued to treat him through the lenses that he was after some sort of validation from me or the world. I did not confront him on the lies but allowed him to feel comfortable telling me what he was ready to tell me. He never did reveal any dishonesty in the end, but he continued to come to the sessions, so I assume he was getting some benefit from it. Most of our sessions were centered around some childhood trauma that also could have been a lie. I eventually had to terminate and refer him to another therapist because I moved. I wish him all the best in life still. I just want to say that the best counselor I ever had let me lie. He knew I was lying. I knew he knew I was lying. He also knew my lying was a self-imposed barrier to avoid talking about what really was hurting me. He was my counselor for 2 years, and quite honestly, gave me the base of learning how to be okay. I'm hoping it was the same for your client. Thank you for being patient with him. Most of the time lies and manipulation are a preservation of the self they have created to protect whatever is broken down underneath. That said, I worked in a supermax male prison a few years ago in the psych ward of segregated housing unit. These guys were in prison. The psych ward section was full of legit sick guys, and guys who wanted to get out the cell way more often than the normal shoe. Talk to ladies any lady will do when in prison, and a lot of therapists in prison are female and have an easier jail time. The dudes that were faking it were the epitome of manipulation and would oftentimes prey on the legit sick guys, and that peed me off. So I came at them hard and documented everything to get them out of my program. Be a lot of scary people off LOL. This thread made me realize I was a bit of a difficult patient. LOL. Chronic liar. But my therapist was an angel and would call me out super gently and wouldn't shame me for it, which is exactly what I needed. Lying is so hard to stop doing because of the fear of people getting furious with you. She was so kind and accepting even when 50% of the things that came out of my mouth were lies. She also by coincidence was at an ice skating rink when I was there with friends while also recovering from social anxiety, and while she kept an appropriate distance and didn't engage, I saw her once smile when she saw me order some snacks by myself without help. That was so heartwarming. I wouldn't be half of who I am today without her. 3. That's so sweet. I've been thinking about therapy and that makes me a lot less intimidated. Trainee, but I've been counseling for a while. I mostly work with kids and parents who've had trauma abuse. I get a lot of kids who lie to hide the abuse or would lie to protect their parents. A lot of suicidal gestures or fake suicide attempts. The absolute worst one I had was a parent who lied telling us all their child was skipping sessions in school without their knowledge. Turns out they were sending their child to a grown man's house in exchange for money. I don't deal with kids much, but I know people at the pediatric hospital who see some really dark crap. The worst part is thinking how many kids there are suffering from repeated sexual abuse, human trafficking, etc. that we never find out about because they haven't been taken to hospital for a severe injury. A while ago in a different state I had a client I was going to send home with mom and she was willing to take them. Baseline drug abuse and running away from home. Mom couldn't keep them around more than a week and this had been going on for a few years, so no reason to admit them to inpatient. I go in to do a brief assessment and talk to client about going home and they immediately went on this dark tirade about how they had 300 ideas of how they could kill themselves in the hospital and about how they wanted to die as slowly as possible and suffer the whole time and make all the people that had hurt them watch. Then moved on to how they wanted to kill a specific person and how they would do it, where they live, etc. Then moved on to talk about the demons that talk to them and tell them things and pull on their body to do things and want them to become a demon too. I had to switch gears and admit them even though it was clearly what they wanted and why they were talking this way. But there was no way at that point that I could justify discharge and mom agreed to let them stay like it was no big deal. Client will apparently pull this kind of thing to get out of going to jail and stay in the hospital when they get in trouble or are mad at their on and off boyfriend. That happened to be a family member that was 13 years older than them, but they wouldn't admit the relationship so that the family member wouldn't get in trouble. Total train wreck, and they played the mental health addiction system like a recorder. They are easier to play than a fiddle. Not a therapy situation, but very manipulative and medical. But I'll have to keep it vague as it's otherwise potentially identifiable. Person X presents with an injury. It's unusual, but not immediately identifiable as self-inflicted. They need treatment but it does not work. At first it seems bad luck. Drugs given into low doses or given in significant overdose. Other treatments just not going right. But it eventually becomes clear the patient is sabotaging things to continue to be seen as sick and needing care. Because of how they interact with people. Some find it hard to believe that they could want to be sick when it is first raised as a possibility. They have many doctors and nurses on their side initially. More effort is out in to try to prevent such sabotage, but still the injury worsening in a surprising way. Other doctors are brought in, advice is sought to ensure we were not missing anything, but nothing works. The patient refuses things that cannot be sabotaged and sabotages that such can be. It becomes clearer over time that the patient is doing things to make their condition worse. Things that no normal person would do. Medical staff lose faith. Eventually there are no doctors left that want anything to do with them. So they get told, we cannot fix your problem. They leave and go immediately to a TV station. And then the newspaper. They tell a horrifying story, but a deeply inaccurate one from the start to the end. The only thing that is true is that they were in the hospital. They make up treatments. They make up staff to play on racial prejudice. They make up arguments where they were abused in their medical background to make it seem like the hospital has been negligent. They sell their injury as a very rare medical condition. and say they have to go overseas to get good care and then ask for money. The hospital could not say anything because of privacy legislation. The only response could be "we cannot comment," which made everyone look guilty. The person raised a lot of money because the community was heavily on their side, because they did not have an accurate picture of the situation. This reminds me of that lady who killed her mother, who used her to get money from people. The lady wasn't really sick, but her mother brought her to hospitals, if I recall correctly, and she was taking meds for made-up illnesses. Whenever a community starts to doubt the lady's conditions, her mother would move her to a different place to do the same thing again. Dialectical behavioral therapist here. I predominantly work with people with a diagnosis of BPD, and unsurprisingly it seems as though borderline personality disorder is getting mentioned quite a lot in this thread. I find BPD is a pretty crappy label for what could rather be much more accurately described as having difficulty regulating emotions and tolerating distress, with quite often a history of childhood trauma and/or poor attachment. It's just easier to label someone as having BPD, so easy that it tends to become synonymous with what is essentially perceived as having a clinical diagnosis of being a C. Clinical director couples therapist. A client asked to use a bathroom during a couples session. The bathroom was next to where we were sitting. Wife quietly whispers to me that she hears snorting noises. I agree with her. She pushes through the bathroom door and finds him snorting pills off the toilet tank. This prompts a breakdown of incredible proportions about childhood trauma that I don't care to recount. This manipulation led to an incredible series of events. In the most tragic case of my career, by far, their teenage son died months later. Wife leaves husband. Husband's illustrious career collapses. The friend of mine who introduced me to this couple died shortly after that. The husband died shortly after that. As if this wasn't enough, there are a few incredibly tragic events that befell the surviving members of the family, but due to anonymity I cannot recount them. Believe me when I say they are on the same level as what I've shared thus far. Let me tell you that seeing an entire social circle decimated this way is chilling. Knowing the extent of their issues in the beginning, I knew some fatality was possible, but never before or since have I seen anything on this level. This sounds like a Stephen King novel in the most gruesome fashion possible. Not a therapist, but had a friend who was a certified pathological liar. The issue being that those kind of people never actually benefit from therapy because they would just lie about treatment. This freaking girl made me think she got an abortion because of me. Made a friend of ours think I sabotaged her relationship. Had all kinds of fake photos and Facebook accounts. What's wild is she's drop dead gorgeous. Guys fell all over her in real life, so some of her claims, dating a reality show star, being harassed, having model friends, having songs written about her, etc., were 100% feasible. Once I started pulling on the thread of some of her lies, they all fell apart. Craziest experience of my life. And there's literally nothing you can do, because they're sick and can't be helped. Pathological liars can be incredibly charismatic and seem total open books and just the realest people you know. It's crazy how you don't realize how crazy they are if you take them at face value. When you live with one, it falls apart a lot faster because you'll be there when they make something up and you know it isn't true because you were with them all weekend or whatever. I had a client with factitious disorder, you probably know it as Munchausen syndrome. And while I was not her therapist, I was her foster care caseworker and the person immediately responsible for her social services care, and it was exhausting. She made up ailments, came to me with bogus medical complaints, exaggerated legitimate medical symptoms, and she even self-injured to get what she wanted, attention from doctors. And once she got the office visit or trip to the ER, she wouldn't come clean unless she felt she was the most important patient that the most important doctor had. Then she would sometimes cop to what she had done. It was also risky. She had legitimate health problems, so we couldn't just ignore her complaints. But when we did, then that was a one-way ticket to self-injury town. In my short time, she managed 2 trips, including throwing herself down a flight of stairs and intentionally taking OD level of acetaminophen. She always ended up okay, but it was a lot of stress for me, her group home, and her entire care team. Not a therapist, but a patient here. I've been in therapy with the same psychologist for several years for depression, stemming from childhood trauma. I had been, am still, doing really well in my program. and had even taken 2 terms of dialectal behavior therapy courses. I was having daily revelations, learning new things I liked about myself and making great strides to find joy. After about 2 years of therapy, I met and eventually married a handsome, charismatic, educated, well-respected man who I somehow never noticed, despite all my therapy as textbook NPD. My mental health plummeted, but I truly thought it was because I was living in a domestic environment for the first time since childhood, so my personal agenda in therapy sessions was focused that way. His language with me was very shaming. He mocked my breathing techniques and tools to fight anxiety attacks. Sometimes during my anxiety attacks he would stand over me with his hands on his hips, furrow his brow with worry and say things like, "See, this is why I don't think you be a good mom when we have kids." There were other things too. Social shaming in front of friends, sexual shaming, controlling my diet, my environment. The guilt for just existing became overwhelming. He would call my therapist to let them know what his issues were with me and what he thought the underlying causes were. When I would get to sessions, my therapist would say, "Well, I got a call from," and we'd spend half the session dismantling my feelings about it. It was such a violation of boundaries. But in the beginning when I confronted him about it, he just said he was trying to be part of my support team like I wanted him to. I kept going to therapy, but the more I worked on it, the less hope I had for recovery because I had no idea how much he was directly undermining any efforts made by both me and my doc. I went to my regular session one day and my therapist said, "So," called me again and said, "You guys were going to have a really difficult conversation tonight, and that you would probably have a really hard time with it." That was basically how I found out my husband was leaving me. Years later, my therapist and I have had a lot of conversations about his attempts to manipulate and monopolize my therapy sessions. They admitted to recognizing the NPD behavior right away, but had to draw a line between directly telling me what to do and helping me learn how to make my own decisions and learn from my own mistakes. It's crazy to have a good relationship with your therapist get damaged by a third-party influence. Thankfully, because we had such a long history together, we've been able to rebuild trust. Apologies for format, grammar, spelling, on mobile and late for work. I'd worry more than a bit about continuing with that therapist for letting your hopefully ex interfere like that. It seems like a rather substantial ethical lapse. I hope you're doing better now. I'm not the therapist, I'm the patient. It's my family. My brothers are allowed to call me names and hit me, threaten me. But if I retaliate, they threaten to call police. Police always favor those who do not have diagnosed mental illness. My mother is an emotional abuser. My interests were constantly put down. I was wrong for liking science and just thought I was better than everyone else. It hurts most because my teachers love her. They love who she is in public. My psychologist is really great and he's helped me plan to sever ties when I can get out of this toxic household. It's so hard though, brainwashed as a child to think the world of my mother, between school and home. Thinking the way I'm treated was normal. Wait, your parents don't hit you isn't a discussion a 5YO should have with her friends. A lot of my depression, anxiety and the like are stemmed from her abuse. I strongly believe she induced some of my anxiety so that she could keep me on a metaphorical leash. Frick you, mom. I can't wait to get out. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, and I'll be so glad when you get away from that toxic environment. I'm rooting for you. Trainee therapist here. As a rule, maybe the reason therapists aren't replying a whole lot to this is because people with BPD, who can often be seen as being manipulative, actually do a lot of the things they do in order to cope with untreated or complex trauma. As such, saying that their behavior is manipulative is blaming and unhelpful. Doesn't make them any less difficult to work with, but it's just not great terminology to use. I'm a psychologist, but the most manipulative thing I've encountered was a person dating someone in my family. They attacked us, our whole family, through text message, sent lies about all of us to each other, and then played the victim. It was truly insane. When confronted, they denied everything. They were obsessed with people from the past, and the perception we in the family had of them. The funny thing is, up until this all happened, I rarely thought about this person. But when I did think of them, it was all good. Now though, I just think they're a psycho. Work-related, a client and residential's parents had to come for family therapy. DCF had custody of my client, and in order to regain custody, family therapy had to take place. The mom arrived for our first session reeking of cigarettes and BO. She apologized for forgetting to wear her dentures, then told me that she was getting her master's degree in psych from the University of Phoenix and one day would be able to be my boss. I'm not sure what happened to her. Whoa, the mental image I have of her. Retired psychiatrist here. I would ask us all to be careful with the term manipulative. Of course there are some people who use other people like toys, but in my decades of work I found that those true manipulators were not very common. Much more common were people who grew up in the midst of neglect and abuse, and who simply never learned a normal way to get their needs met. They never experienced the rules of give and take, or how to extend trust in order to gain trust. So I found that a great many healthcare providers, when they encountered these people, would immediately label them manipulative and treat them dismissively or contemptuously. It's a lot more effective and fun, when encountering a manipulator, to spend a little time educating them about how healthy people go about getting their needs met. It doesn't take that long, it's not deep psychotherapy, and it often makes everything a lot easier pretty quickly. Of course, if you're dealing with a true sociopath, this doesn't work, and then you change your style. Got an apology from my ex-girlfriend's therapist. I dumped her and she sent me 12,000 texts over a 4-month period. She then went on to tell her therapist about how I was abusive and basically a stain on the human race. We live in a small locale. After about a year the therapist figured out it was me that my ex was talking about, realized all the stories were fake, and cut my ex off for good. Who the frick goes to a therapist to lie? Clinical director of a private practice here. Just over 10 years doing couples work myself. Had a woman call me and tell me her husband was a politician who would surely manipulate me in our sessions. I reassured her that manipulation attempts would be addressed. Guy shows up 15 minutes late. I open the door, invite him in, and go sit down. 30 seconds later he still hasn't entered, so I walk back outside my office and see him walking to a different building. He claims he thought the entrance to my office was on the other side. He comes in and they are so toxic to each other. He claims a health issue and leaves 15 minutes early. This is important for later, so keep in mind total session time was about 15 minutes. They contact me to rebook, and normally I don't do email because by the time you go back and forth openings may not be available. I send them my openings. He emails back next day saying they'll take one of the openings. Well, that opening doesn't work. I let them know and they reply demanding compensation due to their confirmed appointment being unavailable. I let them know that telling me you want an appointment at a certain time is not a confirmation. Confirming means both parties okay the meeting time and date. Here's where it really begins. I talk to her on the phone and she tells me autistic children depend on her and I should care more about autism as a therapist. Tries breaking my boundaries down using guilt and shame. I'm not having it, so she puts her husband on. Husband starts using Socratic questioning to try to demonstrate that I am incapable of reasoning like an adult. He tries breaking my boundaries by browbeating me and trying to undermine my confidence. After about 5 minutes of this I tell him I'm not interested in continuing the conversation and that the problem is his lack of ownership in the situation. Eventually they tell me they need the money for a different therapist if they aren't going to see me. Could have been a lie, but I am doing fairly well and after years of dealing with bulls it's so nice to be able to say here's your $200 back, good luck, and be utterly unaffected. In 10 years and out of more than 5,000 clients across many practitioners, they remain the only refund I've ever done. I have never met two people as unreasonable and unpleasant as them, and it isn't even close. It's one of the most common manipulations, but this was an extreme version. What I mean is OMG, I'm so desperate for therapy, please I need to get an ASAP. Oh, tomorrow? Number. I have baseball practice. Can't you just see me Friday? You're off Friday? WTF, why won't you see me after hours? I'm busy. You are a horrible person clueless about business. Not a therapist, but my aunt has been diagnosed with schizophrenia years ago. She is a general pain in the butt to everyone and the entire family has to walk on eggshells for fear that she'll lash out at us. Things had been getting worse, so we suggested she started seeing a therapist. The first therapist was a male and she said she wasn't going to be seeing him anymore because he had flirted with her and tried to touch her inappropriately. Okay. So the next therapist was a female. My aunt said that this lady would tell her that she was ugly and that she would never amount to anything and just horrible things in general. I'm not really sure about details. I don't know if these sessions are recorded. All I know is my aunt didn't make proper complaints or go to the police, and was just generally thrilled to get out of having any counseling. So on behalf of my family, sorry aunt's therapists lol. I have schizophrenia and to be honest when I am unwell I have perceived similar things to what she has said has happened with her therapists. It doesn't actually happen to me but I perceive it as real and the trauma is real. Maybe that is what is going on with her. I'm a clinical assessor and I work at a psych hospital. The worst compulsive liar I saw was a mom who would bring her son in for hospitalization at least once a month. Her son never met criteria to be hospitalized but she would always Google these symptoms and say he has this disorder or that disorder. She was convinced that her son was a psychopath and would describe symptoms of other disorders, then tell the assessors we were inept and stupid. Finally I gave her a referral to a therapist in the area, because you seem like you're under stress and I think this could help you. I'm pretty sure she probably didn't take me up on the referral. Every time I see a thread like this I just remember how much bulls I was subjected to when I was a minor in special ed and psychiatric care and I wasn't able to drop my own mental health professionals. Mental health professionals are people and are not immune to bias or abusive and controlling behavior. I had several who lied to me about the level of confidentiality, told me they would only disclose if I expressed desire to harm myself or others. They were going to give me which put me in outright dangerous situations with my father. I had one who repeatedly advocated against me seeing a pulmonologist for asthma because it was manipulative behavior. I did not get even a basic albuterol inhaler until I was 16 and attending the doctor by myself without my parents. Turns out I have asthma. Whoever could have guessed yes. There are a few responses in this thread that are not in contradiction to the sort of confidentiality psychologists are expected to provide, but whenever I see this thread I see it as an invitation for people like the ones who abused me for years to continue their behavior and further contribute to stigma against mentally ill and developmentally disabled individuals like myself. I'm glad this thread isn't a total shitshow, but still, it makes me incredibly suspicious of many of the responders. Not a therapist, but dated someone who was on a manic episode and extremely manipulative. She faked her mom dying so she could move in with me. Mom was just fine, alive and well. Claimed that her grandma left her an inheritance that got stolen by her stepfather. Stepfather worked for FDIC, so he hypothetically could do that. Right? Wrong? Faked a pregnancy, complete with ultrasound pictures with our names in it. Faked having cancer, so I'd feel bad for her and wouldn't break up with her. She got me a fake job as a freelance writer for a magazine. Her friend was my boss whom I talked on the phone only, and the thousands of dollars in checks I got were forged from her stepfather's account. She bought me a new car with grandma's inheritance because I was an awesome boyfriend. She took a car on a test drive, never brought it back, and all this over the course of 4 months. Holy crap. Bet you're very untrusting now. P.S. We are not all like that. Friend used to say a lot of things like, well my therapist says I need to put myself first, to justify a lot of their behavior regarding other people. Friend tended a lot toward depression, anxiety, had borderline. I asked friend if the therapist knew about their big and variable drug habit. Nope. I recently stopped seeing a girl that would blame everything on her mental health. She constantly told me what her therapist's diagnoses and recommendations were. I'm all for talking about mental health, but at some point it just started sounding like a defense mechanism. She always seemed more interested in the diagnoses than the recommendations. Kinda sucks. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.